help of volunteers, thank you. With the help of volunteers, I track and give input on all timber management projects on the Mount Hood National Forest. So all of these topics are in my head all the time, more than I maybe want. Not as much as SJ and Elaine here. We appreciate them being here. So quick bit of housekeeping before we kick it off. Please, yeah, ensure you stay on mute just to try to prevent disruptions. You'll have a chance to chime in and ask questions at the end. If you have questions as we're going here, feel free to put them in the chat, and we're going to try to balance like verbal and chat questions at the end. Having your camera on is encouraged, not mandatory, but it is nice to know when we're speaking to real humans. But if you aren't feeling it tonight or you got something else going on, don't worry about it. I know how that goes. So I'm going to start by giving a quick intro on the Northwest Forest Plan, sort of set the stage for where we are today. And then I'll give a bit of context and a primer for each of the three sections after that we're going to talk about. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. So after the Second World War, the increasing industrialization along with economic and policy drivers led to widespread clear cutting of old growth in the region's public lands, national forests, and BLM lands. However, the growing scientific and public understanding of the importance of these ecosystems created intense social resistance to this status quo approach of management in the final decades of the 20th century. So things like tree sitting and monkey wrenching and other direct action tactics by grassroots environmental groups resulted in sometimes violent clashes between those groups and loggers and law enforcement. Finally, when the spotted owl was listed as federally endangered in 1989, environmental groups had a robust legal avenue to challenge these federal agencies and their management approach. Many lawsuits and challenges ensued. Judge Dwyer, a Ninth Circuit judge, ordered a halt to all logging on federal lands within the range of the northern spotted owl until these federal agencies could come up with a plan that proved that the agencies were fulfilling their new conservation mandates for the species. SJI blew through a bunch of critical legal history, but all for time's sake. After several failed attempts by the agencies, a deadlock continued, and so the newly elected President Clinton stepped in to start the Northwest Forest Summit, where all sides could come and voice their concerns. And soon after, scientists and policymakers gathered in downtown Portland to create, in just a handful of months, which is pretty crazy, what would eventually become the Northwest Forest Plan. So the acceptance of the Northwest Forest Plan in the law, it was one of the most sweeping changes to land management anywhere in the world. And so then now the 17 national forests within the range of the northern spotted owl, which is Western Washington, Western Oregon, and Northwestern California, were intended to be managed in a way that prioritized the conservation of old growth forests and species and balance that with the Forest Service's mandate to provide a sustainable supply of timber to local communities. So here we are, 30 years after the creation of the Northwest Forest Plan, and it's getting its first major amendment in all of those 30 years. Why does it need amending? As you can imagine, a lot has changed in 30 years. Social values, economic realities, an increased scientific understanding of these ecosystems, fire ecology, and impacts from climate change. Just one example of many of the reasons to change. Climate change was not really considered during the initial development of the forest plan 30 years ago. So it's time, more than time. This amendment has been focused on five main themes. They're all interrelated, so it's hard to put them in their little neat boxes. But in general, those are climate change, sustainable rural communities, and then the focus for us tonight will be on tribal inclusion, old growth forest conservation, and wildfire resilience. And so we are so lucky to be joined by two members of the Federal Advisory Committee, which from here on out we're going to refer to as the FAC, FAC. Um, and if you don't mind, Elaine, we can start with you. Can you tell us who you are, what you do, a little bit about your experience and how you became a member of the FAC?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. And nice to see everybody online this evening. My name is Elaine Harvey. I'm a Yakima tribal citizen, and I currently work for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission as the watershed department manager. And how I come to be on the FAC committee was I was recommended by the Yakima Nation Tribal Council and the DNR superintendent when when it was time to there was an opening for applying for to be on the FAC. And at the time, I was working for Yakama Nation Fisheries, and I have had many years of experience working um, for the Yakama Nation and dealing with the forests, the different forest districts surrounding the Yakama Reservation. And so, they entrusted in me to submit my application with their support. And I did, I was chosen as one of the FAC members. And even though I left Yakama Nation to Critvic, who I work for now, we represent the four Columbia River Treaty tribes. And they thought it would be in their best interest to have me continue to be on the FAC and represent Yakama Nation's issues and concerns. But as a tribal member of the Northwest, I feel that I have a lot of connections with the many different tribes in the Washington state and Oregon. So the plateau tribes, they're we're pretty much similar in our religious beliefs, in the foods that we gather and the medicines. And I'm real familiar with the plateau tribes, which is the eastern tribes of Washington and Oregon, and in their relationship with the national forest that we were discussing this evening.
Thanks, Elaine. Yeah, SJ, over to you. Kind of same question.
Yeah, thanks for having us on today and giving us an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Federal Advisory Committee and our amendment that we're working on with the Forest Service. I'm Susan Jane Brown. I'm with Silvix Resources, which is a nonprofit environmental law firm focused on federal forest law, policy, and collaboration. I split my time between Portland and the East Side out in John Day. So get a little bit of both sides of the Cascades. I have been working on Northwest Forest Plan issues ever since I came to the region. I moved to Oregon to go to law school at Lewis and Clark College um, back in 1997, which was also conveniently right about the time that the Northwest Forest Plan was implemented for the first time because we had a little hiccup there with the salvage rider back in the mid 90s. So I came here to go to law school, and the Northwest Forest Plan was new and it was just being implemented, and it was tensions were still really high in the region. And so started my interest with the plan then. And then when I graduated from law school and got to be a litigating attorney, was involved in a number of lawsuits involving interpretation of the Northwest Forest Plan, prior failed amendments to the Northwest Forest Plan, that sort of thing. So I continue to litigate implementation issues. So been really interested and a fan of the Northwest Forest Plan from the very beginning. I think it's an amazing ecosystem management document and something that should really be celebrated as a really awesome way to think about managing forests. Um, so when I heard that that the Forest Service was putting together a Federal Advisory Committee, like Elaine, I also applied and was lucky enough to be selected. Um, and yeah, it's been a lot of work. This was our year anniversary. We first met in person as a committee back in September of 2003 or 2023, sorry. So it's been a year for us, and looking forward to talking about some of the work we've done.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sure at some point in the future, you're looking forward to getting some rest.
Yeah.
Whenever this is wrapped up. Yeah. So yeah, thanks again for both of you to being here. Really lucky to have you both. So yeah, kind of mentioned 30 years, first really major amendments. I'm wondering, from one or either of you, why is this the first major amendment to take place? And do you have any feelings and recommendations for like how can this happen, in a more common way, maybe an easier way? moving forward.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that first. So yeah, this, as I said, there have been other times in the past when the Forest Service has, and the Bureau of Land Management, because the Northwest Forest Plan used to apply to both the Forest Service and BLM lands within the range of the Owl. And in 2016, BLM revised their forest plans and pulled out of the Northwest Forest Plan. So it's just the Forest Service now. But there have been some attempts to change or eliminate some major portions of the Northwest Forest Plan over the years, particularly regarding the survey and manage provisions, which are those provisions that require the agency to survey for rare species before logging and then buffer that habitat if they find those critters. And then the aquatic conservation strategy, which is designed to protect water quality, water, aquatic processes, that sort of thing, aquatic habitat. And the prior Bush administrations attempted to remove those provisions from the Northwest Forest Plan as a political move. Because when you try to protect critters and aquatics, it turns out that you harvest less timber. And so it was a political move to try to get more timber out of the Northwest Forest Plan region. And those were struck down by the courts. So, we still have survey and manage, and we still have the aquatic conservation strategy. But it has been 30 years, and a lot of things have changed since then. And things like climate change, and I think importantly for us on the FAC, as well as I think tonight, is that in 1994, the federal government did not consult with tribes on the plan. And I think there was one meeting that was like after the decision had really already been made. So the tribal perspectives, and there are more than 82 tribes in the region, that is a huge glaring error and hole. And we owe a lot to our original stewards of these lands, and addressing that and ensuring that Indigenous perspectives are featured in forest management is something we should do. And so things like that, climate change, tribal priorities, dealing with wildfire risk, and frankly, protecting mature and old growth forests, those are all things that the Northwest Forest Plan did not do a good job of. It made some strides on some things, but this is a real opportunity for us to actually do some critical stuff, and really make a positive impact on these lands and the communities that depend on them.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great segue of what you're saying into our first real major section that I want to focus on, which is that tribal inclusion piece. You mentioned it, tribes were not meaningfully included in the first iteration of the plan. I've read and heard from the main authors of that plan have openly regretted that omission in the years since, and have, pushed for change there. And so I really wanted to read, because you said it better than I can, but some of the stuff directly from the FAC recommendations, which were linked in the registration. But I'll quote, the Northwest Forest Plan area includes over 80 tribal nations, many more tribal communities and indigenous-led organizations. Although there is overlap and similarities, each tribe has different treaty rights as well as trust responsibilities owed to them by the federal government. In addition, each tribe has their own historical and culturally significant needs, perspectives, and unique approaches to ecosystem stewardship, as well as adapting to extreme changes in climate and on the land. Another quote, since time immemorial, indigenous communities across the Pacific Northwest have stewarded the land and developed strategic and innovative management practices to sustain communities, ecosystems, and the reciprocity between them. An abundance of historical and scientific research shows that cultural practices and stewardship have contributed to the establishment and maintenance of mature and old growth forest habitats, supported fire adapted ecosystems, and mitigated impacts connected to changing climates, and a history of environmental degradation across the Pacific Northwest. And this section here, over a century of fire suppression, coupled with regulatory restrictions, removal of indigenous practitioners and practices, one of those being cultural fire, as well as assimilationist policies from the boarding school era, have led to today's increased risks from catastrophic wildfire and has also created structural barriers and mechanisms preventing indigenous peoples from enacting sustainable stewardship. The Northwest Forest Plan amendment must signal a shift in tribal relations across the Northwest Forest Plan forests and include an apology for the exclusion of tribal communities from the regional formulation of the Northwest Forest Plan and call for healing and reparations for over a century of settler colonialism, land dispossession, criminalization, and marginalization of indigenous cultural stewardship practices and mismanagement of tribal lands. So, oh, thanks, Jade. So, when the draft environmental impact statement comes out, there is, of course, going to be a lot of arguing back and forth about issues like old growth and active forest management. But what I don't want to, and like that's all well and good, and it's within the rights of people, as this is a public process to speak up for what they care about in these forests. But what I don't want to get lost in all of that discourse is that 20 people from different backgrounds and experiences and interests and skill sets agreed that the U.S. Forest Service has to change the way they are treating and interacting with our indigenous friends and neighbors. I really think that's profound. And so I really appreciate all the work the FACT did. The majority of the recommendations are on this issue, and rightly so. Um, and yeah, again, don't want that to get lost for folks who are listening here today and as we move forward. And so, as I said, yeah, the majority of your recommendations are related to tribal issues, but there was also a separate tribal consultation process that occurred and I think is still occurring during this amendment period. Can you talk a bit about what this process has looked like so far?
Jordan, I can start the conversation. As you know, as Jay mentioned, there are over 82 affected tribes from this Northwest Forest Plan, the 17 forest areas, and I think it's real critical that as many of those tribes, and my wish is that each tribe could be consulted, or they could have input into this amendment, since the 94 plan did not include some of the critical tribal concerns, issues that the tribes have, and it's like the tribal communities have felt the burden of the impacts that this forest plan has had in their usual custom areas where they fish, hunt, and gather. And as a tribal member on this committee, I feel that the Forest Service is taking their best strides to reach out to the affected tribes from north to south, from the northern region all the way down to California. And they're holding webinars with the tribes. They're offering and send out letters to each of the tribes for formal tribal consultation, at the government to government level. And they are making strides to the reach out to the tribes, and incorporate them into this process. But there's the issue also is the tribes, some of the tribes are real small. Even the larger tribes, there's a limited capacity for the tribes to even engage in this process. They're, and I can say from experience as working for Yakama Nation, we're getting AISs thrown at us daily from all, from everywhere. And the staff are overburdened with all of this. We're not just dealing with Forest Service, we're dealing with Columbia River, we're dealing with, there's so many issues that are happening around the tribes. And there's the capacity, tribal capacity is an issue. And so, that was one of the concerns, that we spoke about in our FAC meetings, And since I've been a part of this process, I've been taking it upon myself to go and reach out to tribes, tribal leaders, tribal forestry, DNR staff, to, to talk to them about the importance of this plan and the future of it, how it's going to impact their, their treaty rights or their reserved rights or their tribal rights to the forest lands, and talking to them about being co-stewards. Some of these are are in our recommendations that our tribal inclusion committee came up with. And if you guys get a chance, already looked, there is nearly 113, I believe, tribal inclusion recommendations that our FAC came up with. um, that really talks about tribal access, that talks about co-stewardship, on the Forest Service, honoring tribal rights, treaty reserve rights, which kind of goes into forest management and cultural burning of certain areas of the forest where the tribes, want to gather certain foods, medicines, that have been impacted by the lack of fire on the landscape. But we as a committee, a tribal inclusion committee, we tried our best to address as many issues that we could come up with. And SJ, she took one of she's kind of led us through that. And she's also led us through this whole, um, the whole fact, you know, the uh, the recommendations process. She's one of the leaders for our FAC committee. But I wanted to mention that there are five, that throughout our process, there have been five tribal members on the FAC besides myself. So there's Ryan Reed, he's a Curric tribal member from California, myself, Ryan Miller, who is a Tulalip tribal member. And in the beginning, Bobby Bruno, who is a Warm Springs tribal member, and then Angela Sedona, and she's a Siletz tribal member. So, I'm real thankful that when they made the decision to include, tribes, that they also included, some tribal members from, a good, it shows representatively, from the Tulalip tribes down to California. And also, I like to also mention Ann House. She's a tribal attorney for the Snoqualmie tribe, and she did, help us in developing these recommendations. But getting back to your question of tribal inclusion, I just feel I've expressed more than once in our FAC committee meetings that the Forest Service, really needs to try, 100% to reach out to the tribes to encourage consultation. And I know there have been consultation requests by some of the tribes. And, there's just so many issues at stake that, the tribes have and could, be included in this plan, even after the draft EIS is um, is put out for on, and release. Um, I'll I'll let Susan, SJ.
I don't know. I think you did a great job there, Elaine. Yeah, it's been great to have as much tribal participation as we have on the actual committee, and um, I think the Forest Service can do a lot better in terms of how it outreaches to tribes. And I think one of the things that or sort of new culture we're trying to encourage the Forest Service towards is to really view consultation not as a one-off, but as a relationship with
Yeah.
with the tribes that use those national forests. Um, and because it's it's not very authentic when someone comes to you and says, "Hey, we've got this idea and it's pretty baked already. Hope you like it."
Mm,
And that's kind of how the Forest Service often shows up in these spaces when it comes to formal consultation, rather than really working with their tribal staff and tribal councils to really integrate what tribes want to see done on that land. And if the tribes do have capacity and want to help steward some of those lands, by all means, let's set up, a co-stewardship agreement to make sure that we can get that, underway and on the ground. So there's room for improvement for the Forest Service, and we hear good things from the agency about our tribal inclusion plan components, and it sounds like they're going to include hopefully the vast majority of them. Um, so that's good. And that's new behavior. So that's
mm.
good and should be encouraged. And now we just need to kind of hold their hands while they get it over the finish line, because it's a different way of doing business for the Forest Service, and change is hard.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. One of the issues I'd love to talk about a bit, so the commercial exploitation of huckleberries, and other, special forest products, as the Forest Service calls them, has been highlighted by you, Elaine, and others. I know this discussion has happened in the FAC, and I've tuned into the live streams. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about your experience with that. What have some of the impacts of commercial harvest of huckleberry been? And what are some of the recommendations the FAC is making for protecting treaty rights and access to first foods?
Yeah, Jordan, it's been kind of one of the highlights that concerns that I have is the commercialization of culturally significant species like huckleberries and beargrass and mushrooms. Um, you know, um, the Forest Service commercialized or turned some of these species, culturally significant species, into forest products without the tribe's consent or input. They just did it. And for huckleberries, for example, the commercialization has gotten really out of hand in Washington. I can speak for my experience on the Gifford Pinchot. Everyone knows that it's known for the huckleberry resource. And even though, we're losing tribal access to our traditional huckleberry gathering areas, because of the thousands of commercial pickers on the landscape. The same time, we're losing huckleberry habitat. I was raised up on the Gifford Pinchot since I was a child, so I've been up there my whole life, every summer, spending 2 to 3 months migrating, I guess you can say, or following the huckleberries as they ripened. So I have a pretty good knowledge. I guess you can say it's traditional ecological knowledge of the locations of where huckleberry. We have a good production of huckleberries would be on different areas of the national forest in the Gifford Pinchot. And so I've been working with Yakama Nation and the Gifford Pinchot over the years, identifying areas for huckleberry restoration. And I always tell the Gifford Pinchot in our meetings, I'm reluctant to share some of my knowledge with you. And I said, because I feel that I feel that these areas will be restored. But for who?
Mm,
Is it going to be restored and become a productive huckleberry area for the commercial pickers? Or will it be an area that our tribes can go to harvest for subsistence and ceremonial purposes? And I've repeatedly told them I know the forest, I know the huckleberry areas, and I can tell you guys, where these areas are. And one of the how we're losing the huckleberry habitat is the lack of cultural burning. and the encroachment of fir trees is just taking over the berries, the berry fields. So I know where the habitat needs to be restored, and it will be restored, and but I tell them I'm reluctant to, share this information with you. And the only reason I did that along with one of our tribal councilmen, um, we decided we would share with the Forest Service five. This is our first plan, areas to restore locations, was because we have concern for our future generations. It's like, even though, we got to share with the commercial people, we're going to identify areas just to expand the huckleberry habitat. And it's a hard decision for us. And every year we go to our MOU meetings with the National Forest and we tell them what's our concerns. And this last April, I asked them finally, show me your statistics. How many commercial pickers are in the forest? I want to know. And they told us over 50,000 commercial permits were sold. And I said, that's that number. And, just thinking about the number of tribal people on the landscape, the number of personal use pickers on the landscape. Then you have the commercial people, and then there's a mismanagement of the huckleberries because they don't even know what's coming off the forest. Now, there's some estimates in the northern part of the forest, there's 800,000 gallons that they have commercial buyers surrounding the national forest, and we're getting numbers now. What's coming off of the national forest, and 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 as tribal people, we're competing with 50,000 plus pickers, and we're not getting very much to feed our families, to feed our longhouses, and it's getting worse every year. And there's a mismanagement because the Forest Service don't even know what's coming off the forest. They don't even know, and there's not even a cap. It's like, oh yeah, we can just keep selling permits, and there's not a cap on the number of permits sold. It's an unknown number of what's coming off the forest. What are the tribal people allotted? And what is the wildlife allotted? They're getting the short end of the stick because I go up into the woods and I go to all these huckleberry areas where the commercial people are too. They're taking it all. I can go there and there's there's hardly any berries on the bush. So what are the wildlife getting? Because in our huckleberry habitats, you have bear grass, you have bear berries and huckleberries. This is all important bear habitat, and they're just taking it all. And it's just getting so bad every year. And we bring the issues up, and the Forest Service tells us, well, we have to manage the forest for everybody. And what they're forgetting is the tribes have a reserved right to these huckleberries, and they should be prioritized, and they should be managed, and they should allow the tribes to manage the huckleberry fields. And so these are some of the issues that I've been bringing up. And in our recommendations, we have a recommendation, where it talks about culturally significant plant species, that are impacted by commercialization. And, it's really, this situation is getting way out of hand. And one reason I say it's mismanaged is because they only have 2 officers on the whole Gifford Pinchot who have other duties besides monitoring commercial pickers. And, you have 50,000 pickers out there commercially picking, and they're commercially picking. It's almost to a state where it's where I can see a tragedy of the commons. That's how bad it's getting and serious it's getting. And it's just, that's where it's at today. And it's so, for us tribal people, it's not just the Yakimas, the coastal tribes, Puget Sound tribes, the northern Washington tribes, even the Oregon tribes. Many tribes come to the Gifford Pinchot because it's a known productive huckleberry gathering area. And it has a lot of archaeological and, prehistorical and historical tribal evidence of, tribal usage besides huckleberries. We go up there for ceremonies, and my longhouse has a feast in the huckleberry fields in Indian Heaven every year. And so, just an example of important resource, important food, and that is now getting scarce.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. Appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, really important for folks to know about that issue. Um, Actually, if you have something to add, please do. My question was sort of like, what are some of the biggest potential changes for management in the Forest Service? Uh, Biggest changes for management if the Forest Service includes your recommendations on tribal inclusion. I know that's a broad question, but I wonder if you've got, a few ideas for either of you.
I don't know. I think Elaine, you should you should answer that from your perspective. I'd love to hear what you think sort of our top 10 or top two or three biggest hits are in our recommendations.
In our recommendations, I just want to, it's probably not one of the top 10, but I think it's an important one because the Forest Service has a high turnover rate. And that's probably where the root of some of these issues coming from. People come from far away, they, get a job in these different forest districts, and they don't understand the local tribes. They don't understand the local tribal history. They don't understand treaty rights. And, so every year we're constantly educating the forest supervisors, the forest rangers, forest enforcement, and even, all the scientists. We're educating everybody. And sometimes it gets old, but we feel it's important. But the Forest Service should take it upon themselves also to have some sort of curriculum for their employees, at the district level. Like, here is the tribes around this Forest Service. Here are some of their treaty or their tribal rights. Some of this needs to be shared with all the new staff. So it's not a burden on the tribes to educate them. And it's not just the Forest Service. We're educating everybody. We're educating Washington, Oregon states. We're educating everybody, and it's kind of an ongoing issue. But the Forest Service seems like it has one of the highest turnover rates for us to deal with. But anyway, I think promoting and having that open door for the tribes to be co-stewards is essential into the future. And that's part of our recommendations. And like, especially for the Curric tribe, they're known to be fire keepers and utilizing fire in the landscape for enhancing different parts of the forest for it's not it's yeah, it's for like fire resiliency into the future, but also enhancing like some of their cultural species. And then, even for us, we would like to utilize cultural burning for huckleberries, and even in meadow systems. Our meadows are degraded. They're continuously to get degraded on the national forest. And that's where we like to gather some of our roots and medicines. But bringing fire to the meadow systems is kind of like turning the soil or replenishing the soil nutrients. And that's all been a lack. It hasn't been done. And so I think, that co-stewardship part of the tribes really, being and having that open door to the tribes, to be co-stewards is, I think is important into the future. And I know there are so many important recommendations that are in there, really. But yeah, even just having that tribal access, and with the commercialization of some of these forest products that the Forest Service wants to call forest products,
Yeah.
it limits our access, really. We're in competition, and not just for huckleberries, for mushrooms, for beargrass, for all different sorts of important, culturally important species. And I think the Forest Service really needs to reevaluate their species that they are calling forest products, because they've never consulted with the tribes when it comes to some of these um, forest products that they want to call for us. We don't call them forest products. It's a food or a medicine, or it's we don't think of it in that manner of a dollar value. It's subsistence or ceremonial to us. And so so hopefully, that would be evaluated into the future, because that's real detrimental to our life way. and and people don't understand and forget that the treaty tribes, the treaty signers, there wouldn't be any treaties if those reserved rights weren't ensured in those treaties of the 1855 years, 1856 of Washington. And those treaties, um, our tribal chiefs and leaders signed those treaties. And the only reason they did was because it stated in there that we will retain our reserve right to fish, hunt, and gather. And there's some court cases that happened, the US versus Washington, where that opened the door for like the Yakama Nation to be a co-manager of salmon in the Columbia Basin, and the other treaty tribes in the Puget Sounds. And it's all because of those reserve rights that our ancestors, ensured that we had those reserve rights. And the Forest Service is a federal agency, and they have an obligation to uphold those rights, because those rights are the supreme law of the land. They, they are, and we're limited on access to our food, which was reserved once again in that treaty. It's people need to understand that, and they don't.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of people will look at how many of the recommendations are related to tribal issues, but like they're all interconnected, and that tribal inclusion piece impacts all of the other pieces of this amendment as well. Um, I wish we had so much more time. I promised everybody we talk about these three sections, so I'm going to move on to old growth, but again with the idea that like these recommendations all overlap with one another. But just to give a yeah,
There's a question in the chat for Elaine that I think
okay,
would be real quick if you
okay,
don't
yeah.
mind. Richard O'Donnell asked for Elaine, are commercial pickers required to have a permit? And if the permit conditions included an obligation to provide a fixed amount to the tribes, would that level the playing field at all?
Yeah, the commercial pickers are supposed to have a permit, um, but there's issues with that. I mean, the Forest Service have found 10 people under one permit, for example. But yeah, I I can't really like speak to, or say that I can't speak on behalf of all the tribes. And for like the commercial pickers to give a certain amount to the tribes, I can't really speak to that. But what I can speak to is, when we go out and gather our foods, we do it in a ceremonial way. So I'm pretty sure the commercial pickers aren't gathering in a ceremonial way, and we'd rather be able to pick those berries ourselves and have access to those, and not have to like depend on someone else. I mean, it's it's not just a food. It's like it's really hard to explain. And I know we're in limited time, but I'm just it's I believe, just speaking from our Yakima perspective and from our elders, we would rather be out there gathering our own berries and having full access to them, and not competing with thousands of people.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Elaine. I think a part of this too, you might remind me on the number, but a commercial picking permit is like 35 bucks or something like that, and they can make that back in a single gallon of huckleberries. I mean, the these companies who are paying commercial pickers are making a killing off of this, again, quote unquote special forest product. Um, and yeah, the tribes are being really like, yeah, severely impacted by that and the overharvest. Is that right? Like 35 bucks or something like that?
I believe it was like the last I heard it was about 70 or
Okay.
75 range,
Okay.
but still a gallon of berries can go for 100 on average.
Yeah. Okay. Um, okay. Well, yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about old growth now. So one of the main ways that the original Northwest Forest Plan aimed to halt the widespread logging of old forest was to place the best and most contiguous areas of remaining forest into what are called late successional reserves, and those reserves have much stricter guidelines for what can and can't happen there. But some of those older forests were left without protection, and they were expected to be part of the harvest base moving forward. In fact, a quote I found: 50% of the timber expected to be harvested under the Northwest Forest Plan was to come from forests that were at least 150 years old. And in the early days of the plan, like 95 to 98-ish, total timber sale offerings in the Northwest Forest Plan area approached the projected 875 million board feet. But sale offerings began to fall and dropped to approximately 150 million board feet by 2000. These are coming from this book. It's going to blur it. Oh, anyway, it's called the Making of the Northwest Forest Plan by three of the primary authors of the plan. So pretty good primary source for what they went through and the things they care about. And so what happened, right? What happened with this drop in board feet? Well, probably the main thing was social change. So again, coming from the same book, in 1986, 70% of Oregon residents surveyed supported the harvest of old growth. But in 2001, just 15 years later, 75% of Oregon and Washington residents believe that all old growth should be protected from logging. So in just 15 years, those numbers completely flipped, 75 or 70% pro to 75% against. And then, of course, with all of that was a large network of forest activists and defense groups such as Bark, founded in 1999, have and continue to challenge Forest Service projects that include old growth logging. So there's probably a lot of reasons for the Forest Service to want to include this. Another would be the executive order and some of the stuff that's come out of the Biden administration, but probably also these, continued lawsuit after lawsuit in these controversial areas is a sink of resources and money and time. And so it's part of the amendment process now. And so my question for our two guests is, what is the FAC recommending the Forest Service do to strengthen protections for old growth forests and also growing more of it on the landscape?
So I'll take a stab at that. So the FAC is doing a couple of things on the mature and old growth issue. And then there are a couple of things that we definitely are not doing. So what we are working on is a targeted amendment of the Northwest Forest Plan, not a revision. So we're only making some changes. We are not changing everything. So that's important to keep in mind because there's a major the major parts of the Northwest Forest Plan are not going to change with this amendment. And so one of the things that is not going to change is the land use allocations. So we call that the lines on the map. So the late successional reserves or LSRs, for example, are not going to change. Their boundaries are not going to change. Same thing with riparian reserves or matrix or adaptive management areas. So none of that's going to change. But we can change what goes on inside those lines on the map. And so the forest stewardship recommendations that the committee has put forward are in narrative form as opposed to plan components. So like when you look at the tribal inclusion recommendations, you'll see that they're written in kind of legalistic ways. And that is because they are in plan component language to comply with the Forest Service's 2012 planning rule, which directs how forest plans are revised and amended. And so most of our recommendations are in that sort of legalistic language, but our forest stewardship recommendations are not. So they are in narrative form. And so we're going to have to see how the Forest Service translates our narrative recommendations into that legalistic plan component stuff. So we still need to see what they're going to do there. But in terms of the themes that we recommended, we started by recognizing that, well, first of all, that forests are really diverse and dynamic. And when you've seen one stand of trees, you've seen one stand of trees, right? And so we recognize that forests are really variable, particularly across our region. The forests on, the Olympic Peninsula are very different than the forests on the Shasta Trinity or the Klamath National Forest. And the forests on the GP, on the Gifford Pinchot, are very different than the forests on the east side of the Deschutes National Forest, right? Even on the Mount Hood, like Mount Hood has a lot of forest diversity on it. It's thought of as a west side forest, meaning that it's on the west side of the Cascades, and it is, but it's also got this chunk of it that's on the dry side. And it looks a lot like a ponderosa pine forest that you might find on the Ochocos, further east. So we recognize that there's a lot of diversity in the forests that we're working with. The one thing they have in common is that they're home to spotted owls. But spotted owls, can nest in all kinds of different stuff, right? And so we recognize that the forests are diverse. And we also recognize that you got to figure out how to manage them in some ways. And so we recommended that, as the 1994 Northwest Forest Plan does, it basically groups forests into moist forests or dry forests. That's a really coarse distinction. It's also a really super Western science focused way to kind of bin forests. But we decided that we were going to go that way because we quickly realized that it was really difficult to get much more fine scale than that at the scale we are working at, which is, whatever it is, 19 million acres. So like we needed something that we could use that was coarse enough, but accurate enough that we felt like we could make some recommendations about how to manage these forests. So we went with the moist dry distinction. And then we also thought about land use allocations. So in late successional reserves, those are areas that are to be set aside as large blocks of intact, late successional, mature, and old growth forests. Then you also have the matrix, which is the timber harvest base, land base, where we're going to cut timber from on a programmed or scheduled or predictable way. And we can't change those lines on the map. So we got to deal with those land use allocations. So thinking about the moist dry distinction and the land use allocations that we were working with, we essentially recommended that old trees that are 200 years of age and older, wherever they are found, are off limits. And the only place that they are currently on limits is in the matrix. So we recommend that we protect all trees older than 200 years of age in the matrix, in the moist matrix. We also recommend that the harvest of most of the mature forests in moist matrix land use allocations should also be conserved. So forests that are older than 125 years of age, mature forests, would also be essentially off limits to logging. We recognize that there may be some rare cases where some sort of vegetation management might be appropriate in forests that are older than 125 years of age. But we expect that to be really rare. So under the status quo, all of that is open to logging. We also recommended that in moist late successional reserves, that the Forest Service be allowed to restore plantations, so old clear cuts, up to 125 years of age. And once the forests and the moist LSRs get older than 125, it's all off limits. And the reason why we did that is because even though the idea behind LSRs is that they're going to be these intact areas of older forests, the fact of the matter is that when they were set aside, there was about 80% of them were in older forest conditions, meaning that about 20% of them were not. And those were recent clear cuts. And so we have these plantations that are located in the LSRs that look like Christmas tree farms, and they are not providing mature or old growth forest characteristics or habitat. And the science indicates that active management of those old plantations would help set them on a trajectory to become old growth faster. And so the committee was persuaded by that rationale. And so we recommended raising the age limit in moist LSRs from 80 years of age to 125 years of age. We recognize that that might be controversial with some. But we also think that it's worth restoring those plantations to put them on an older forest trajectory faster. And so came up with that recommendation. For those dry forests that we've got out there, regardless of land use allocation, whether it's an LSR or if it's matrix or AMA, we recommend the protection of trees older than 150 years of age. And then the stewardship of mature age classes in dry forests as ecologically appropriate, which will look different in different places. That's going to look different on the dry side of Mount Hood than it will on the Rogue Siskiyou down in Southern Oregon. So what we're trying to do with those recommendations is to protect certainly old growth trees and to protect most of the high quality mature forests as well, all of which are open to harvest currently under the status quo. So we think that's an improvement. Mm-hmm. We're also recommending no salvage logging in late successional reserves, which can and does happen under the status quo. And we are recommending that salvage continue to allow to be to occur in the matrix, but that all live trees and all dead old trees are retained. So the biological legacies of that burn stand would be retained if salvage logging in matrix was authorized, which is something that makes me pretty uncomfortable. I don't like salvage logging. I do a lot of salvage litigation. But in terms of that's the land, that's the harvest land base. That's where we're going to have programmed timber harvest. If we can retain the biological legacies at the same time, that's an improvement over the status quo. So again, not everyone, myself included, and I know Elaine included, not everyone is equally as enthusiastic about our recommendations as other people about other parts of our recommendations. But we do think that that what we're recommending is an improvement and that it follows the best available Western and Indigenous science.
Yeah.
So did I leave anything out there, Elaine?
Well, I think you covered it pretty good for our time limit here. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, this stuff is tough because, like you said, these forests are so different from one another, and it can be different, on one side of a hill on the other.
Totally.
So it's complicated. How do you make policy that covers an entire region to handle those, site level differences?
Yeah. And I see
yeah.
Mia's question, which is a good question. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, if the Forest Service does our recommendations, then yeah, they could not harvest those trees in a CE. So yeah, I mean, we're hoping that and what we've heard from the timber industry reps on the committee is that they don't want to log old growth. and they kind of really don't want mature forests either because the trees are too big, and the mills have retooled to take smaller diameter stuff. And so um, we said, okay, let's write that down.
Yeah.
And we'll, I think the committee generally feels pretty good about our recommendations. Again, we've all got some concerns around certain things, but I think we feel pretty good about those recommendations. And if that is common ground that people can live with, that would be a big step forward. And we would get a whole bunch of really great tribal inclusion plan components too.
Yeah. I think I've heard you say before that the representatives of the timber industry on the fact what they really care about the most is like predictability and like what to expect year to year in terms of harvest.
Mhm.
And so for them, if you get some of this off the table, the more
Mhm.
controversial stuff, for them it means okay, well it'll be more predictable maybe less
Mhm.
lawsuits, or at least that's the hope.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's sort of that's a big part of their justification because and I know you guys see this on the Mount Hood all the time where if it's old growth and it's in the matrix, the Northwest Forest Plan allows it to be logged. And you'll have Forest Service folks, again, many who are just showing up brand new on the scene and like don't know anything about anything and are there to, show that they can manage the forest. They're going to read the forest plan. And if the forest plan says, hey, I can log some old growth and I'm going to follow my forest plan, I'm going to do that. It's a distraction for everybody. Bark isn't going to like it. The timber industry is like, we don't really want it. And the Forest Service is going to get distracted by trying to justify this timber sale that the public doesn't want and the industry doesn't really want either. So taking it off the table um, is kind of just doing what everybody says they're okay with doing. And so let's do it. Let's do it. Let's write it down and get everybody on the same page. Let's do it. Um, so I'm excited to, I've been fighting for old growth and mature forests for a really long time, and it would be great to have that cemented, so that we can focus on other things like, cultural burning and prescribed fire and culvert repairs and stuff like that. That's what I'd rather work on.
Yeah. And so, yeah, maybe a handful of minutes left to talk about this. You kind of mentioned it, but yeah, there's, obviously a large network of activists and defense groups that were born out of the timber wars who keep tabs on what the Forest Service does. That's part of my job, right? So
Mm-hmm.
with the understanding that these recommendations are based on consensus, and like you've said, they're not everybody's perfect list,
Mm-hmm.
where might there continue to be conflict regarding old growth or just really forest management in general? Big
Mm-hmm.
question, but
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer that, and I'd love to hear Elaine your thoughts too. You know, I do think that as the Forest Service refines our recommendations around forest stewardship, I think that there will be some disagreement there. And we'll just have to kind of see where those actual areas of disagreement are. Um, so I think there's potential for disagreement there. Um, we've had some interesting conversations, and I see that Karen Hans is on. Karen is another one of our FACA committee members. Um, we've had some interesting conversations about the amount of fire on the west side of the Cascades in the moist forests.
Mm,
I'm pretty convinced that there's a lot more fire on the west side than we thought, and a heck of a lot more cultural burning on the west side than conventional wisdom would tell us. Um, but there are some folks who are really concerned about putting too much fire into those west side forests. And I don't think anyone on our committee is saying, let's go take a drip torch everywhere on the west side. I don't think anybody's saying that. But figuring out where the contours of that conversation are is, I think, going to be interesting. And relatedly, manage wildfire. So when we do get fire, wherever it is in the Owls Range, what do we do about it? I don't think personally that putting every fire out is a good idea or sustainable. I think we need to work with fire, but inevitably there are some fires that we're going to have to put out. So which ones are those? How do we manage, how do we use fire for resource benefit? Those are some interesting conversations that may or may not make their way into future recommendations or even the amendment. But in terms of informing the Forest Service's fire management policy, I think our conversations are really super timely.
Yeah.
So, Elaine, what do you think are our areas of disagreement might be moving forward?
Well, I personally, I think that the first 6 months we're really working on um the different sections of our amendment, and then coming up with the recommendations, and then we have to go through another 2 or 3 months of kind of going through each recommendation to see what and where each fact member stood on each recommendation. And it kind of, to me, because we're all coming from different backgrounds and viewpoints, we have our own perspectives, but I think um, it shows that we could find common ground on some of these issues. um, and and then I've heard some feedback after our recommendations have been posted, and released on the Forest Service website, of organization groups that were happy with some of our recommendations, and then some that were, already not happy with them. So, and what I'm kind of wondering, what's going to happen after the DIS is released, and what are we going to hear? What are we going, what I mean, what's going to come as a result of the DIS, our recommendations, and then what the Forest Service is developing and coming up in their analysis, that even us as fact members haven't seen completely yet. So, it's kind of, to me, that's what I'm looking forward to. And I know, there's going to be a lot of disagreements outside of our fact, and of what our recommendations are, but even maybe just what the Forest Service came up with in their analysis that they're conducting. And so, but I think it goes to show, that us 2022 fact members, we can come together. We spent hours and hours on these recommendations. We spent hours and hours, weekly, cumulatively. I don't know how many hours, especially SJ, spent on evaluating each of these recommendations. I was on a few committees. SJ was on more, but it took a lot of our time. But it also, made us work together and learn from one another. And I really appreciate, everything that we've done so far. It's been a year, over in a year, and looking forward to what's um, after the DIS.
Yeah, thanks, Yubal. So we talked a little bit about fire. So I'm going to take advantage of that and segue into the final section, which is about fire and fire resilience in our forests. So those old growth forests that we talked about, that were heavily logged in the second half of the 20th century, had developed through complex interactions between climate and disturbance, like fire, and people. The constant return of fire in varying intensities across different intervals of time create a mosaic of forest types and structures. And that mosaic can occur at the regional scale, like we kind of mentioned, that the moist coastal forests are, full of like carbon and down woody debris, to the more open, dry, fire-prone forests that we have on the east side of Mount Hood or down into the southern part of the project area. That mosaic can also occur at much smaller scales, just like a landscape, watershed, subwatershed. Fire might burn differently on a north-facing slope versus a south-facing slope, right adjacent from one another. So it introduced a lot of diversity into the forest. And then, of course, indigenous peoples' use of fire played a critical part in shaping this mosaic and these ecosystems. But in the last 100 years, this reciprocal balance has been disrupted, 100 plus years. Indigenous people were disempowered and their stewardship practices were outlawed. Diverse and fire-adapted forests were clear-cut and replaced with even-aged tree plantations. And overarching all of this, right, the Forest Service's strict policy of fire suppression did not allow fire to play its critical role in supporting biodiversity across the landscape, and still doesn't. And so all of those factors together have created a landscape that, in many ways, is ill-equipped, if that's the right word, to respond to the expected impacts from climate change, and increases in weather events like we saw in the 2020 Labor Day fires. A couple quotes from the FAC recommendations. One is, quote, fire is inevitable, and managers need to work with fire and not against fire to accomplish the goals of the Northwest Forest Plan. And then another one is indigenous cultural burning, prescribed fire, and wildland fire all need to be considered holistically to build fire resilience into our forests and communities now and into the future. Um, so, yeah, this is a big question, but I mean, what parts of the Northwest Forest Plan do you feel were lacking and in need of change when it comes to wildfire management and resilience in our forest ecosystems?
So I'll start with that one. So as I said before, the Northwest Forest Plan in 94 did sort of bin forests into moist and dry. And so did recognize that um, moisture gradient was also reflective of disturbance regimes. So the drier forests saw more fire more frequently, and therefore developed their successional pathways based on that disturbance regime. Whereas on the moist, most of the moist west side, those forests are very have a lot of biomass in them. They're pretty moist all of the time and are very infrequent disturbance forests. But when they are disturbed, whether that's by fire or volcanic eruption or windstorms, which we get all of that in our region, those disturbances are high severity and high mortality. They tend to, like our Labor Day fires, they're hot, dry, windy conditions, and you get a lot of high severity, high mortality results. Same thing with volcanic eruption and windstorms, right? So those kinds of disturbances on the west side also influence how those forests develop. So there was that recognition in the 1994 plan, and there was a recognition that the drier forests probably need more active management because of fire suppression. Those forests are at a density that is not sustainable. And so that was recognized in the 94 plan, but the depth of our understanding about the dry forests and climate change and how climate is driving the drying out of the forests that historically were pretty moist. Like our understanding of how climate is really starting to affect even our moist forests is growing a lot. And we have a better understanding of what climate change is doing to those drier forests. And we're also starting to understand how climate change is affecting even those moist forests. I don't need to tell you, you go out in the woods in the summer, and it's like, hey, this used to be a kind of moist, cool forest, and it's awfully dry. And that's not how things used to be, right? And so we know that climate change is affecting these forests, and we know that with greater certainty. We also have a better understanding that that silvicultural intervention, so thinning and in particular restoration of fire, can do a lot of good in some of these forests. In some forests, it's not appropriate, no question. But in some forests, particularly those drier forests, putting fire back on the ground is something that we've got to do. And we need to do it at scale. Because if we don't, and even if we try, I don't think we're necessarily going to be successful. Climate and Mother Nature is going to do it for us. There's no question that we've got more fire in our future. So really the question is how do we want that fire and how do we want that smoke? And to the extent that there are places where we can, as humans, take responsibility and do some thinning and burning, we should do that, I think. And I totally recognize that not everyone has a lot of comfort with that. And that's okay. That's totally okay. We're not saying that we have to do this everywhere. We're saying in some places we probably need to do some more thinning and burning. And where we've got, plantations, old clear cuts that look like Christmas tree farms, we might want to do some silvicultural treatments in those forests as well, to restore their heterogeneity and to, have a commercial byproduct. We have a lot of rural communities in our region that are still very much dependent on federal timber harvests. And that is okay too. There's nothing wrong with that. And so as a socioeconomic component of our regional economy, making sure that those rural communities are not forgotten and left behind is also something that's important to a lot of people on the committee, including me. And so, having that balance of making sure that we protect and conserve what we really need to, I think is pretty important. And again, our depth of understanding of how humans fit into this landscape, particularly tribal perspective and indigenous management, co-stewardship. I think there's a lot of room for all of those things. And these forests are really important to a lot of people. People care really deeply about these forests. And so listening to those perspectives and making sure that they can all see themselves in our amendment is something that is of really high interest to a lot of us on the committee.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts, Elaine? Want to make sure you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I believe, Susan did describe it real well. But I'm glad, welfare resilience was one of our main focal areas that our FAC committee, we worked. I wasn't really on the committee. I kind of focused my time more on the tribal or climate change, tribal inclusion, but like y'all mentioned before, that some of the tribal issues are kind of, they fit into all of the categories, and fire resiliency, is really important because for the tribes, because many of our tribes borderlines are, they border the national forests, and fire has been transferred on both ways, from the forest land to the reservation. And like, for example, the Yakima and the Warm Springs tribe lost, thousands of acres of tribal forest lands because of wildfire. And so, just from the tribal perspective, that's, some of the important issues that some of the tribes brought up, is the importance of, of trying to create or have a forest landscape that, into the future with climate change, that will be resilient, that it could be resilient. And so I'm, glad that we have support from our fellow FAC and the Forest Service. And we were talking about cultural burning and how the tribes utilize cultural burning, and it wasn't just in kind of like a careless manner that the tribes did cultural burning, and the cultural burning was done for a purpose. And that's why, we see different, our elders talk about the lack of cultural burning. Now we have, invasive species coming in, and then we have the bugs. If those cultural burns, those prescribed burns would have, or natural burns would have, did their course, then we wouldn't have so much of, what we're the negative things we're seeing on the forest. And then um, when we have unmanaged systems, forest systems where, just so much understory, and then, a spark goes in there, and then we have these catastrophic fires. And, it's just a big important component of the amendment, I believe, that, we try to address, and as a committee, and, from different perspectives, and I'm glad that our FAC committee come with these different backgrounds and experience, and to come up with some of these recommendations that are in our that you can follow up on. But yeah, um, fire resilience is key, and looking into the future. And yeah, so I think SJ did cover it pretty well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we'll move into the Q&A section in just a bit, and I saw there's a question in the chat that's very relevant. I think one last one I'd love to ask is, sort of like what is gonna, as it relates to fire and wildfire resilience, what might be the biggest change in management direction if your recs are accepted? And I think maybe part of the answer is like the Forest Service has to find more ways to get fire on the ground or work with managed wildfire. But I'd love for you all to speak to that.
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. And I guess I would also say that um, to facilitate, so again, we've said all things are sort of related, and you touch one thing, you touch a whole bunch of other things, but um, in order to get fire on the ground in some places, mechanical harvest is going to need to precede the reintroduction of fire. And for some folks, that's going to be a change, and they may not want to see that. So I think that's one potential change. Um, the committee is also very aware of rural communities that are in the WUI. They're surrounded by the forest, and there are a lot of those kinds of communities on the Mount Hood. Um, and the 2020 fires are still very fresh in everyone's mind, and the fact that we almost burned up a number of rural communities across our region is very front and center for a lot of folks. And so we didn't really tie a neat bow on these recommendations, but we had some recommendations around the creation of community protection areas, which are essentially, areas around rural communities where wildfire risk reduction would be prioritized. And so that generally means more intense timber harvest in those areas than you would ordinarily want to prescribe for forest resilience or forest restoration elsewhere. And so, I think that makes sense to designate those areas around those communities where what we are really going to focus on there is reducing community risk to wildfire transmitted from the forest lands. Um, it's going to be a lot of timber harvest around those communities, and I'm not sure how that's going to land with folks. I know that I like spending time at my place in John Day, which is in the WUI, and I like it because I'm in the forest. So a lot of people like living in the WUI because they like living in the forest. And yet it's those forests and those trees that are in a lot of ways putting their homes at risk and their communities at risk. So how that's going to land with the public how that's going to land with, community members, how it's going to land with Bark. I don't know. That could be a really big change for folks. Um, so I don't know about that one. I mean, again, I think it's pretty important that we not burn up rural communities. Um, and sometimes you got to make trade-offs. And is the public willing to accept that trade-off? I don't know. I don't know. I think we're going to have to find out.
Mm. Yeah, and we will find out.
We will find out.
But what I'm learning as I'm getting introduced to policy making is like sometimes you just have to write the policy and see
Yeah,
how it goes. And I mean, hopefully then you can revise it or amend it on
yeah,
a
make
more regular
changes.
basis. But
Right.
yeah.
Yep.
Um, well, I guess we can transition, yeah, into the sort of Q&A. There was already one that's very relevant that was in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to address it at all. Seen a lot of thinning and piling in huge piles, presumably will be burned. How do we address fire suppression policies that the Forest Service has that may be leading to more timber harvests? And how do we ensure future forests if young forests are being cut? I think it's a great question.
Yeah. I have also seen some of these really ginormous slash piles on the Mount Hood, and they are really ginormous
Mm,
in places. Holy
mm,
moly. Um, and I get it, but that is obviously a fire risk. Um, and if we don't burn those piles pretty quickly, then they're really a hazard because you do get, not even necessarily a Labor Day event, but you get just sort of your normal average wildfire. And if it hits those piles, like that is going to cause some fire effects you're not going to like. So untreated piles, slash piles need to be addressed. And, then we start to get into, well, why isn't the Forest Service burning those piles? Well, they're probably not burning those piles because they don't have the staff to do it, or they don't have the money to do it, or their higher priority is fighting the for reals wildfire as opposed to burning their hand piles. So I don't have an answer for you on what we do about those huge slash piles. Uh, it's a problem. I agree, and that's not something that we really addressed in our recommendations. But I agree with you; it's a problem. Um, Fire suppression Forest Service policies, that's another one. We no longer adhere to the 10 a.m. policy, which was that policy that the Forest Service created back in the 20s, where we put out every fire by 10 a.m. the day after it's spotted, right? And that is great, except for the fact that when you put out all the fires, you then have this accumulation of debris that when you do get a fire, you get effects that you do not like and are not characteristic. So fire suppression is not a winning long-term strategy. Um, and if we want fire to play its intended role in the landscape, we're going to have to help get it there, in my view. And that means in the right places, thinning and reintroduction of fire. And then when we do get natural ignitions, then managing that fire for resource benefit. And that may mean sometimes putting it out, but it preserves our options to work with fire now and to recognize that sometimes we're going to have to cut some trees before we can work with fire. Not everywhere, but in some places.
mm,
So it's sort of a coordinated strategy for how you deal with all of these issues. Um, and it's the same thing with recruiting forests, both recruiting mature forests so that those mature forests can recruit into old forests, but also recognizing that there is wildlife that and other human needs and desires and wants from age classes that are not old forests.
mm.
And providing for all of those age classes on the forest is important for a lot of people and a lot of wildlife. So thinking about how we do that in a coordinated manner really is what forest planning is all about. Um, Now, again, our amendment is very narrow and we are only doing a couple of things. So it's a lot of things that are important, but we're not doing all of the things. And so thinking about how we manage the entire forest for all of those uses and needs is really what forest plan revision is about.
Yeah.
And that's a fun conversation as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll speak just briefly on the piles of slash and stuff. So I participate in collaborative groups on the Mount Hood, and one of the things that the collaborative group says in all of our comments to the projects on the forest is that they need to burn these piles within 2 years. And they have gotten some staff on the east side to help with that, which is great. It's great to hear that. It's also, I think, up to me and up to us as
Mhm.
the collaborative to make sure that stuff is actually happening within the timeframes that we suggested. But yeah, great question. So I'm gonna open it up. If you have a question you'd love to ask verbally, please use like the raise hand function. Also, Jade was saying that she got a bunch of questions sent directly to her. So Jade, maybe you can start with one of those.
Sure. I'm going to go to this question from Alistair Phoenix, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but I'll put the original text in the chat. Wants to know if you all could provide more insights on how the recommendations ensure habitat connectivity, particularly with mixed age stands and species diversity. That's the first question of three. The next one is about wildfire management, and we kind of talked about the salvage logging. So anything more on prescribed burns. And the third part was about balancing, and again, this has been touched on, balancing immediate fire risk reduction with maintaining long-term forest health and habitat structure. I'm going to put this in the chat because it's a long one, but feel free to respond to any of the foregoing.
Yeah. So habitat connectivity. So there are requirements in the Northwest Forest Plan around habitat connectivity that the committee is not recommending change. Um, so to the extent that the existing Northwest Forest Plan provides for habitat connectivity, we're not messing with any of that. So I think that hopefully answers your question there. I think the recommendations that we have provided on salvage logging are relatively relatively straightforward. No salvage logging in late successional reserves, full stop. And then in the matrix, which is the timber base, salvage with retention of biological legacies is what we have recommended. And biological legacies in this context mean any live tree, standing old tree. So they're not going to get all of the old trees that were old growth before it burned. And retention of down woody debris. So generally speaking, what we have talked about on the committee, and again, we'll see what the Forest Service does with our narrative recommendations. One of the ways that we've talked about this is that we would envision salvage in the moist matrix, basically doing what you would do pre-fire to restore heterogeneity in a stand. So you would take out the smaller, younger stuff that still had, because it's been affected by fire, that still had merchantable volume or value. But you're going to leave those big old snags and live trees. So those are the retentions of the biological legacies in the moist matrix. But again, we'll see how the Forest Service lands those.
Yeah. I think a big thing like if you go out into some of the private timberland that was burned in the Riverside fire in 2020, they salvaged almost immediately, and their
Yeah.
version of salvage, everything is gone. And the whole point of these is to try to prevent that part from happening, even in the part of the forest that's meant for harvest.
Right.
Because that is really, that's not a typical occurrence after a wildfire. You're going to have these big charred trees and snags and down logs and all those things left, which are important habitat values. Uh, so trying to move the needle in, yeah, the positive direction overall would be huge. Um, if there's nobody else with their hand raised, Jade, do you have another one of those chat questions?
I do. I was just stringing together a couple here. So this is for Elaine from Andrew Spaeth. And there's, again, several questions here, so I'm putting them in the chat. He wonders if you have anything to say or if you're familiar with the Wacoma Huckleberry Enhancement Project on Mount Hood National Forest, if you know anything about the historic picking areas. And the other question was more broadly about how we restore the huckleberry areas that you were describing had been lost. How do we create or restore those huckleberry?
Sorry to make you do that, Jade. Yeah, I was just curious because Elaine referenced that we had lost a lot of huckleberry areas, and we on the east side of Mount Hood on the Hood River Ranger District worked with the collaborative in the Mount Hood National Forest for a few years on this Wacoma Huckleberry Enhancement Project, and just curious to get her take on any kind of there was a lot of really interesting things that we found about the historic practices of actually stripping cedars in that area and then creating these areas, these like dugout areas where the huckleberries had been processed. And then also just the historic use of fire in that area seemed to be the main way that huckleberries had been maintained over time. But obviously the loss of indigenous stewardship and then fire suppression for 150 plus years has led to most of those areas being, looking really different today than what they historically look like. So
Yeah, Jade and Andrew, in response, I'm not personally familiar with the Wacoma Huckleberry Enhancement Project, but I've been involved with Huckleberry Enhancement Restoration projects on the Gifford Pinchot in the southern area, which is in Indian Heaven or even off of the Indian Heaven Wilderness area, and also up in north in the northern area. So that would be like towards Packwood and different I guess collaboratives have worked in the northern area to restore huckleberry, and it's from the site visits I that I was up there, they did mostly thinning and not burning. But in the southern on the Gifford Pinchot, we were trying different tools. So we were focusing in like in these plantation areas where they did some logging, thinning, and then we promoted burning, doing some burning in those areas, and then we identified some areas, small areas, I guess you can say test plots, to do thinning and then burning, and then it takes a long time for the huckleberries to come back after a burn, but we did see positive results from the burn. And then there was a section on the Indian Heaven Wilderness area that was a natural lightning strike burn, and I believe the Forest Service allowed that to burn and watched it and controlled it so it wouldn't get out of hand. And those berries are actually coming back, and then that was about 5 or 6 years ago. But yeah, so we're trying different methods. In some cases, we feel like we're worried to burn the huckleberries because it takes so long for a return. So some of our tribal elders recommended and possibly trying pruning some of the huckleberries back, as looking at different methods of enhancing the huckleberry and the production. But also I like to mention that after the Mount St. Helens explosion, a lot of people thought, oh yeah, it's kind of like, oh, we're going to lose so much. But really, today, currently, where you find the thickest layers of the Mount St. Helens ash, those are the most productive huckleberry areas in
Mm.
comparison to other parts of the forest where, it didn't have so much influence from the ash. So areas that are closer, I guess you can say, to Mount St. Helens, those huckleberries we've personally, just my own experience being out there and picking, is the most productive areas to get huckleberries, the biggest and the best ones. But yeah, natural disasters aren't so negative, I guess you can say. And, it actually helped. And maybe because, we don't have burning on the landscape, that kind of, that whole Mount St. Helens explosion actually assisted, with some of the natural restoration that the tribes would have done.
Mm.
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. Yeah, anybody else, Jade? You haven't got any other messages, questions?
I think Elaine may have just answered this, but Mia asked in the all chat, do any of the forests in the Northwest Forest Plan allow managed wildfire?
Mm,
I
good
think it's
question.
real minimal in the Gifford Pinchot there. It's been minimal in the Gifford Pinchot's has a MOU with Yakama Nation currently. And this was after the 94 plan and the Yakimas actually, went to court. And part of the settlement agreement was the Gifford Pinchot would have a ongoing MOU with Yakima. And Yakima has been really pushing for, huckleberry restoration and incorporating fire in the landscape. But I would say it's in the early stages still. And so the areas that burning has been done on is real minimal. And I think the Forest Service is thinking of it more as a experimental in the experimental stage right now.
Yeah, I think I still try to figure this stuff out for the Mount Hood too. And there's a difference between like if it's allowed and if forest managers will actually do it. Um, my experience is folks are really risk adverse, which like I don't like blame them, right? It's not my neck that's on the line, so to speak. If I'm encouraging this to happen, and we probably many of us have heard about the burn boss that was arrested. Was that in Eastern Oregon a few years ago?
Yeah, that was on my force. That was on the
It,
Malheur. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So like
Yeah.
there's reasons to be risk adverse and to be
Yep.
nervous about it. But we got to figure out ways for sure.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are some underlying forest plans that some of them prohibit the use of fire for anything, like no prescribed fire. Cultural burning isn't even in the lexicon. No, and it's thou shalt put out every fire. And that's because we've got the underlying forest plans that we're working with were written in the 1980s, and so these forest plans are pretty old. They don't reflect any of the best available Western or indigenous science. And so some forest plans are like, no fire, full stop. But then, like Jordan was saying, there are other forests that may have that flexibility. Um, but there's definitely a chilling effect, certainly from the arrest of the burn boss on the Malheur, but also just the escaped fires in New Mexico and Colorado, for example. Like people, Forest Service folks are real leery and understandably so. And so, how do we do all of the things that we need to do there? We need more fire on the ground. We need communities and particularly at-risk populations. So children, older folks, people with underlying conditions. Like we need to keep those people safe. We need to keep communities safe. We need to get more fire on the ground. There's going to be more fire because climate change. So how do we make all of those things work together? And it's tricky, and I think it's going to be a slow process while we get everybody comfortable, including air regulators and um, everybody comfortable with what we're talking about, because it is a change.
Mm.
It's definitely a change.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? I'll wrap it up near the end with some sort of things we can do moving forward. But anybody else have a question and want to speak up or post in the chat? Yeah, well, Woody, that leads right into what my follow-up was I think I saw an email today that said, so Woody asked, what action can we take? I saw an email today that said that it was delayed again, the publication of the draft environmental impact statement in November. I don't know if there's a more specific date that y'all can have, but maybe you can tell us for the folks who want to get involved, when and how we can do that and share our voice.
Yeah, so unfortunately, yes, the DEIS, we were expecting that next Friday, and it is going to be delayed probably about a month. Forest Service had some inaccuracies that they needed to correct. So they're going to take the time to get the DEIS correct, which is great. Um, there, so when the DEIS is released, and the Forest Service will let folks know that it's out in a couple different ways. One, they have a press release that you can sign up to receive, and there is a sign up on the Forest Service's webpage to um, be added to the list. So anytime there's any information, you will be added to the Forest Service's list. So when they send out stuff, you will get it. And that will include things like, hey, the DEIS is available and you can submit public comments. We also understand that during the comment period, which the Forest Service has said is going to be 90 days, although FACA committee is asking for 120 days,
Mm-hmm.
um, that the agency is going to do some sort of forest specific engagements. So each national forest will have some sort of meeting, at least one. So I presume that the Mount Hood will have some sort of meeting, and it'll be a public meeting where you can ask questions and learn stuff, that sort of thing. I hope they do more than one. It's one of the reasons to ask for more than 90 days. So
Yeah.
120 days would be good, because then the public has more time to attend those kinds of events. The public comment period, if it begins in early November for 90 days, that's November, December, January, which I'm sure that your calendars are quite busy during that period of time. And we're doing this election thing and hopefully inaugurating a new administration. And so there's a lot going on that I think giving the public 120 days to comment makes sense. BARC may want to ask for that. But when that public comment period comes, then comment. Go to those in-person meetings when they're available. I am sure that BARC will do other sorts of educational events for members, maybe some field checking, although that's not a great time to field check. So yeah, I think stay tuned and check your email from BARC and sign up for the Forest Service so you can get those kinds of announcements directly from the agency.
Yeah, definitely. I'll be reading through that stuff. It'll be hacked into my brain. I'll try to, yeah, and basically, I want to have ways to share information with our supporters in multiple ways, and some training and stuff. There was a great question posted by Alistair in the chat, about recommendations providing any pathways for economic growth, such as job creation through rural job skill training, advocating for increased support for tribal communities, for additional resources for staff development and skill building, etc.
Yeah, great question. And yes, we do have some recommendations in that space. The problem that we ran into is that we can't, in a forest plan amendment, um, direct the spending of money. And so things like investing in or creating worker retraining programs We can suggest that the agency create the program, but we can't make them fund it. And so things like workforce development is something that the committee is definitely going to be leaning into more now that our first set of recommendations are done, because workforce, youth workforce, tribal workforce, rural community economic development, all of that stuff is not really well suited to go into a forest plan amendment. It's stuff that needs to happen outside of your forest plan. It's stuff that Congress needs to appropriate money for, and the Forest Service needs to task staff to do. It's stuff like that, which we can't really make those decisions in a forest plan amendment. But the committee is really super interested in all of that. And so I think that that is going to be a big part of the work that we do between now and when our charter ends. Because in addition to making sure the amendment gets across the finish line, we want that supporting stuff to happen as well, because it is really important. And without workforce, none of the restoration work that we want to see happen is going to happen. And tribes need the federal government support to build their own workforces for co-stewardship and ultimately co-management. So there needs to be more done around that, and we're going to give it our best shot.
Yeah, thanks. Elaine, not to put you on the spot, but before I close up, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I think the question that SJ was addressing, I think if you guys were all able to join us last week on, we were talking about leadership commitments and some of these, what was mentioned about, building capacity and workforce are included, a few of them at least, in the leadership commitments, but our two regional supervisors, are taking it upon themselves and their staff to address some of these commitments that will not be, addressed in the amendment, like SJ mentioned. But we did cover that for like 2.5 days, I believe, on our last FAC meeting, and so we were kind of addressing those section by section, but it's worthwhile to take a look at those and see what our regional supervisors of 5 and 6, they're really important issues that they want to ensure that are going to be addressed and not left out. And these are issues and recommendations that we identified as a FAC, and and they were taken out of our list of the official recommendations because they could be addressed under leadership commitments. So yeah, we did spend a lot of time on those this past week. So and that's covering some of the issues that aren't in the recommendations right now. So yeah, if we're at the end, I just want to thank everybody for joining and taking time to hear SJ and I, and we really hope for the best with this amendment. So once in a lifetime, probably for me to be a part of. And some of us, we tease Ryan Reed because he's so young, and we tease him. Well, maybe you'll be around, if there's another amendment down the road, because he's the youngest one in our FAC committee. But he brought so much to the table. Yeah, he brought so much. And but thank you all.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Yeah, I've never met Ryan, but I'm a big fan. Jay, were you about to say something?
Well, I think Mia wanted to say something quickly.
Sure.
Yeah, this was a last minute. I was trying to put it in the chat, and then I thought I would just ask it out loud. And this is a little bit to the side of the Northwest Forest Plan question, but the issue of the impact of commercial huckleberry picking is I feel like I've only recently learned about this, and it's really troubling. And I know that this process will be moving somewhat slowly, um, and I wonder if there are ways that there could be public pressure applied to decision makers in the Gifford Pinchot, letter writing or other kinds of public input, and if there are if there are talking points or specific individuals to be addressed. If Elaine, if you have any of that information, if you do, and if that's something that you could share with Bark to help share with members. I think it's a place where we could apply public pressure, in addition to supporting the work of the committee. And I also want to both thank you both so very much for your work for the last year and for your lifetimes in your advocacy work. So thank you for all of that.
Mm.
Yeah, Mia, I do have some information, and could share with Bark. And yeah, I think more pressure on the Forest Service to rightfully manage huckleberries and other, culturally significant species, is important. And working on a High Country News article on this topic. And I've been really trying to get awareness out, because there's not a lot of awareness out of the circumstance that we're dealing with. But yeah, I could get Bark some information, and I think writing to Region 6 supervisor and the Gifford Pinchot, would be helpful too.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both so much. This is every time y'all speak or I tune in, I learn so much. And of course, I nerd out on this stuff. I love it. So really appreciate you both and everybody here who's attended and, given some of your time this evening to spend it with all of us. So thank you all. Be well, go in good health. I'm sure we'll see you again soon. And yeah, we'll be in touch. I'll send out the recording to the list. So if you registered, you should get it. Yeah, take care.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. Good night,
Of
y'all.
course.
Yeah, good
Bye.
night.